Sit back, because this is going to get a little weird. Now I'm not one for ghosts, ghouls, spirits, or any of that jazz. I'm more of a, show me and I'll believe it type of girl. Being from the small town of Berlin, Ohio, the town folk here fill you with the tales of the Amish. You know, how their culture is, the things they do and don't like. I've never been one to believe it, simply because from what I've seen there hasn't been much difference between their way of life and that of the other people here. We kept our distance for the most part to respect their wishes, but anytime we've seen them at the local market they've been as nice as can be. Granted, it's been the normal hi and bye. But still. Nothing too out of the way that would cause any reason to panic. The scary stories my mom used to tell me before bed about how if you're bad, one of them might drag me to their community and make me churn butter might have made me feel a certain type of way. Nonetheless, being 17, I'm pretty confident those were just scary stories, given the trouble I've been in the past. Most days, school is just your routine day-to-day experience. Go in, listen to the jocks talk about the latest party, the popular kids talk about fashion, and me and my crew, the film nerds, rave out about the newest camera to hit the market. I'm by no means the most known person in my high school. Come to think of it, I'm probably considered legally invisible. That is, except for my friend Mark. He's the peanut butter to my whole wheat bread. Jess! Hey! Did you see it? The new Nikon, Mark yelled from across the hall. I'm pretty sure no one else even acknowledged his existence except me. Before I have a chance to respond, Mark whips out the new Nikon Z98K. With a retail value of over $5,000, he explained how he had spent the summer prior saving every penny he could, working at the market. It was absolutely breathtaking, but I'll spare you the nerdy details. Jessica, this is it. We're going to make cinematic history. I snatch it from his hands and begin to examine it. Every detail, every cut and groove. With something like this we couldn't just look at it, we had to try it out. We rushed to the empty classroom to formulate a plan of what to film first. I gave the normal ideas. Something in nature, people watching, things that would be quick to render down and put on YouTube. Mark, however, had other plans. He wanted to do something that's never been done before without permission. He wanted to break into the Yoder community grounds in the Amish community and do an in-depth screening of their way of life. As intrusive and illegal as that sounded, the thought of making that kind of masterpiece set my blood on fire. But how? When? Where would we even begin this journey? His parents were leaving for Cleveland this weekend and entrusted him to hold the fort down. As fast as the idea left his mouth was as fast as all the pieces came together. We had a fail-proof log of what to say and do to throw our parents off for Friday after school. The day finally came. After all the classes, and pretending to be concerned about who won the Revolutionary War, the final bell rang, excusing us from school. It was time. Mark, being the pre-planner that he is, had already packed a bag for the weekend's adventure. Some trail mix, a flashlight, a blanket, and bear repellent. Even though there was an almost 0% chance that we would encounter a grizzly, I thought it was sweet that he had taken all those precautions. My parents were under the impression I was staying at Mark's to configure his new camera, and Mark's were under the same. They rarely talked to each other when it came to things like these, mainly because we've never done anything like this before. We are pretty trustworthy, mild-mannered teens, with no rap sheet of heavy partying, so the thought of climbing out of windows never crossed our parents' minds. We fled from the schoolyard as fast as our legs could take us, ready to hop into his Chevy Cruze and speed off like a NASCAR race. We completed our checks on supplies, and made sure the camera was charged, along with the reserve battery. We couldn't infiltrate the community until nightfall, so along the way we stopped and went over the plans a few times over. It was simple. Approach the community from the darker side where there was little to no buildings. There was a bush line we could camouflage ourselves in to give us extra coverage. From there we would go into blackout mode. The Nikon had a night vision mode on it, so we would use that as our guide. We wouldn't be breaking into anyone's house or anything illegal, we would just get as much footage to cut down and make a scary video of. We hit one of the gas stations that stayed open later to resupply our stash. Some energy drinks and Slim Jims would do us just fine. In this particular one, it felt a little off. There were no surveillance cameras protruding out of the walls, and no dinging door alarm alerting the clerk that someone had entered. Almost as if they weren't expecting anyone to shop there. We got what we needed and went to the front register. There was a silver bell that sat right beside the register that read "Ring for help." Mark rang it a few times and stepped back, waiting for someone to come check us out. A few minutes went by, and still no response. Mark looked at me with a bewildered look on his face. I looked to him and said, "Should we bolt?" Mark looked terrified, as if I had just asked him to rob a bank. Still, no clerk. I grabbed the goods and started towards the car. He froze for a split second and followed behind me. What a rush! It was absolutely exhilarating. As we pulled out of the gas station, I began drinking one of the energy drinks. As I gulped it down, I couldn't help but to hear a voice, almost lifelike, saying, "Look behind me." I turned back to see the gas station in the rear window. A shadow figure stood there, almost as if he was frozen in time. A slender man, looks to stand about 6 foot. He had an untamed beard, with overalls, and a hat that looked like it was from the Pilgrim era. He didn't move once, he just stood and watched as we drove away. Mark was driving like a bat out of hell, but still no movement from the man that stood on the corner of the building. We traveled a little ways away from that spot to arrive at our final destination. Mark pulled the car over and shut all the lights off. It was time. He loaded up the backpack and turned the camera on. I was manning the flashlight during our ascent towards the community. Keep in mind, what we were doing was very much frowned upon and could wind us up into some major trouble if we were caught. Stealth was a must. At the slightest sight of inconvenience, we were out of there and would head back home. The walk wasn't too bad. The distance from the car to the blackout spot was a mere 15 yards. There was an old barn near the bush line. That's where we will go dark. As we approached the designated spot, Mark signaled for the light to go off. There was no talking aloud, so hand gestures were key. Even though the only military experience either one of us had was Call of Duty, we reacted how soldiers would in the movies. As I turned off the flashlight, Mark put the camera into night vision. The air was still and there was no movement from the houses that surrounded our immediate area. Mark gave me a slight push to the shoulder. He had seen a light flicker from the barn. There it was, the footage we needed. One by one, the townspeople had started walking towards the barn. It seemed as if they were drawn to it like a moth to a flame. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Was it a late-night mass? Was somebody getting married? It didn't matter. It was happening and we were getting it all on film. As I turned to Mark to give him a high five, I realized his look had turned cold and his eyes were fixated on the barn door. There he was. The man from the gas station. But how did he get here so quickly? There were no other cars there, and for him to travel on horse and carriage would have taken him twice the time it had taken us to arrive. This shouldn't have been a big deal, if it wasn't for the object in his hand. It looked as if he was carrying some sort of demonic ritual tool. I couldn't make it out. It was something I've never seen before. Once all the members had entered the barn, I knew it was time to go. We had our footage, and I've had my fill of fright. Mark, however, wanted more. There has to be something else, Jessica. Let's go see what they are up to, Mark cried out. I couldn't move. Every fiber of my being was halted by fear. I couldn't leave Mark. He was going, rather I went with him or not. We rushed to one of the windows on the barn. What we saw, we couldn't describe. Hundreds of people in one building, with nothing but candlelight, all singing the same hymn. There was an altar in the middle of the structure. It looked like it had been used multiple times before. The dried blood from past encounters, the smell of flesh, unsavoring to the senses. I could vomit, but I knew if I made the slightest sound, we would be the participants for that unholy piece of carved marble. Mark, with his mouth wide open, couldn't stop recording. I wanted to scream, "That's enough, we've gotten what we've come for." But no words could leave my mouth. Just the faintest of air leaving my body, as if it were being sucked out by a vacuum. The hymns got louder as two big, strong men drag a woman to the altar. Her cries and pleas fell upon deaf ears as the synchronized singing only amplified. They flung her body across the altar and bound her hands to the top of it. The strange man from our early encounter approached over her helpless body. His shadow casted a veil over her. Her fight for life was over. With both hands he raised that object over her, and proceeded to continue with the ritual. With one swift slash he plundered the blade into her chest. She panted for a short while, screaming and crying out for someone to help. With her fleeting breath we heard her say, "I'm not the one who should die today." With that her head fell onto the marble, and her young life had ended. I couldn't hold my cries in as I let out a whimper. From my standpoint it was faint, but it was loud enough for one of the clergy members to point at the window to alert the others they were not alone. Mark and I ducked down to hide as best as we could. We stayed down for what seemed like an eternity, but in reality it was only a few seconds. As we arose, we peeked back into the window to make sure we weren't seen, so we could make in haste escape. To our surprise, the barn that was filled with hundreds of people was now empty. We didn't stand around to see where they had went. We gathered the camera and flashlight and ran as fast as we could through the night-covered bush. No lights, no guidance, just fear to guide us. As we crossed over the failure hill, which was our blackout spot, we could see it. The white Chevy Cruze. It was so close I could feel the worn-out fabric and smell of the moldy ham sandwich that had been in the backseat for months. There was nothing that could stop us from making it to salvation. We zigzagged into the clearing before seeing him, the ominous man that had plagued our night. He and about 4 others cut out our escape route. They had to have flanked us while we were hiding from the barn ceremony. I stopped dead in my tracks. This was it, the last day I'll ever have on this earth. There was no time for crying. I had to make it home and apologize to my parents, and promise them I would never leave the house again. I took out the flashlight Mark had given me and lit it right into the Amish men's eyes. They were stunned for a moment, but a moment is all we needed. I shifted my stance and went around them to get to the passenger door. I had the keys, so once I was safely in I started the car. I waited on Mark to make his heroic entrance as he usually does. But no Mark. I couldn't wait any longer. I opened the door to call for him, but he had beat me to the punch. All I could hear was the blood-gurgling screams of help as one by one the men took turns punishing him. I wanted to save him. I wanted us to go be Buckeyes together in the university. I wanted him to live to tell his grandchildren how we had escaped that one night with the Amish. But I knew there would only be one survivor that night. Without hesitation I jumped into the driver's seat and put the pedal to the floor. I looked back in the rearview mirror and seen 2 of the men holding a lifeless Mark, while that gas station figure stood in the same manner as before. Almost as if he were giving me a taunt. The news broke the morning of a missing child who had went into the Amish community, and I had to be the one to tell Mark's parents what had happened in detail. The local law enforcement had conducted a search of the grounds, however they didn't find anything or anyone at the location I had gave. They told his grieving family that all they found was Mark's body, on that bloody altar with a message carved into his torso. The message read, "To all who shall enter shall be cursed." The night speaks to us all, and we all must answer. Those words were bone-chilling, and dropped the temperature 40 degrees in the house. I knew that community wouldn't just let me off scot-free to tell the tale. I knew this was far from over. I knew this was far from over. I knew this was